She was fluent in 9 languages, but at work, she was completely invisible. Eleanor Hayes showed up early, stayed late, and carried the quiet grace of someone who'd lived a life no one ever asked about. To her colleagues, she was just the secretary, but behind her soft voice and careful notes hid a woman who had once taught at a university in Geneva and who now spent her nights translating children's books into languages she'd never get credit for. Until one day in a freezing boardroom in Amsterdam, the only person who could save a multi-million-dollar deal was her. What would you do if the world finally needed your voice after years of ignoring it? This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about being seen and the quiet courage it takes to stay kind in a world that often isn't. If this story touches your heart, leave us a comment and subscribe to support more stories that honor the unseen. Now, let's begin. She showed up early, stayed late, and knew 9 languages. But to them, she was just the secretary. Every morning, before the lights flickered on at Carlisle & Gray's 34th floor office in Midtown Manhattan, Eleanor Hayes had already been there. She arrived quietly, with a book tucked under one arm and a reusable coffee cup in the other. Her heels made no sound on the marble floors. She moved like she had learned not to take up space. By the time the first executive assistant booted up their workstation, Eleanor had already reviewed the CEO's itinerary, sorted the priority memos, and translated a 10-page briefing from German to English, just in case Mr. Carlisle needed it, though he rarely asked. She didn't mind. There was comfort in structure. Her desk sat directly outside the CEO's corner office. Glass walls, black leather chairs, and a view that stretched all the way to the Hudson River. The view didn't matter much to Eleanor. What she noticed were the people. The glances, the unspoken rankings that ran deeper than titles. She had no nameplate, just executive assistant, in meetings. She introduced herself as Eleanor. People nodded, smiled politely, then talked over her. None of them knew she once taught at the University of Geneva, or that she had lived in 4 countries, or that she could switch between Spanish, French, German, Dutch, Japanese, Italian, and Portuguese without missing a beat. To them, she was well-spoken, punctual, and very neat, a useful presence, a background character, and she had learned not to take that personally. Her evenings were quiet. Brooklyn was loud and restless, but her studio apartment was a world apart, lined with books, softly lit by a standing lamp near the window. At night, she translated children's stories for a non-profit that published bilingual picture books. It paid very little, but Eleanor loved the rhythm of it, the way language felt like music in her hands. She believed that stories told in the right tongue could reach across oceans. She rarely watched TV, but when she did, it was always with subtitles just for the joy of knowing she didn't need them. Nathan Carlisle, her boss, arrived every morning at exactly 8:17, not 8:15, not 8:20. His schedule had no room for softness. He rarely said good morning, and when he did, it was more out of obligation than warmth. Eleanor didn't mind. She understood him in ways he likely didn't expect. Men like him didn't get that way by accident. They were built brick by brick out of survival. Nathan had founded Carlisle & Gray a decade ago and turned it into one of the fastest-growing private equity firms in the city. He was sharp, calculated, and famously allergic to inefficiency. To him, everything was a transaction. That included time, empathy, and connection. Eleanor had learned how to stay out of his way, but also how to make herself useful. On good days, he would nod in approval of her briefings. On others, he would scan them without a word and drop them on her desk, not unkindly, just dismissively. She kept a spreadsheet on her personal laptop titled Things He'll Never Ask For But Might Need. It included international holidays, preferred seating charts, and company contacts fluent in non-English markets. One Tuesday morning, Eleanor was invited to sit in on a high-level meeting. It was about expansion Europe and Southeast Asia markets that required sensitivity to nuance and more than Google Translate. She wasn't required to speak, just to take notes. The room was full investors, regional consultants, and the usual chorus of sharp suits and sharper opinions. Charts were shown, numbers tossed around like poker chips. At one point, the discussion turned to a set of proposals from a Dutch firm, all in their native language. The meeting stalled. Eleanor gently raised her hand. If helpful, I could provide a translated summary of those documents by end of day. The room fell still. Nathan didn't even look up from his tablet. He just let out a soft, breathy chuckle. Then came the words that would stay with her far longer than they should have. We're not running a language school here. There was a brief silence. Some looked down, others smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from recognition. The quiet kind that comes when you realize someone never really saw you. She nodded once, calmly, and returned to her notes. No rebuttal, no change in tone. But her pen stopped moving, and when it resumed, it was slower, more deliberate. That evening, back in Brooklyn, Eleanor reread the Dutch proposal, not because she had to, but because that's what she did when something or someone underestimated her. And the next morning, she arrived even earlier than usual, not to prove anything, just to be ready. Her routine didn't change. Her smile remained intact, but something in her gaze had shifted a kind of stillness that comes not from defeat, but from patience. At 8:17, Nathan arrived. He passed by her desk with a distracted nod. She returned it. But as he walked into his office, she allowed herself one long look at the man who had dismissed her so quickly. Not with resentment, not with pride, just curiosity, as if silently wondering, what would he say if he actually knew who I was? That night, in her small Brooklyn apartment, she turned the last page of a Dutch children's book and began translating its opening line. Outside, snow began to fall quiet, steady, like the way Eleanor had always shown up. Quiet, steady, until one day they would have no choice but to see her. By day, she was a shadow. By night, she translated stories for children she'd never meet. Brooklyn never really slept, even on the quietest blocks. You could always hear something: a distant train, the soft rumble of a radiator, the occasional clatter of someone unlocking their front door too late at night. But Eleanor's little studio apartment, tucked on the third floor of a brownstone near Park Slope, was a kind of refuge from all that. It smelled faintly of bergamot and paper. One wall was lined with books, most of them worn at the corners, their spines creased and lovingly tired. A single lamp in the corner cast a warm glow across the room, softening the edges of the day. This was her favorite time. After the noise of the office, after the emails and meetings and polite half-smiles, here, she was no one's secretary. Here, she was simply Eleanor. She would change into a worn sweatshirt, tie her hair up, and curl onto her old green armchair with a laptop perched on her knees. Then she would begin typing word by word, line by line, translating picture books from one language to another. Tonight, it was a story about a lost bear in Tokyo. She moved gently through the phrases, her fingers careful, deliberate, not just converting words, but capturing meaning, emotion, rhythm. She often thought about the children who might read these stories, kids in hospital beds, shelters, or classrooms where English was still strange and unfamiliar. She would never meet them, but somehow she was speaking to them. It made the long days worth it. Most nights, around 9 p.m., she called her grandmother. Lillian lived alone in a small cottage in Vermont, tucked between pine trees and wild silence. They had always been close. It was Lillian who taught Eleanor her first French lullabies, who read to her in Spanish, who insisted that language was more than communication, it was connection. Their conversations were often simple. How was work? What did you cook tonight? Did you see the moon? But sometimes they wandered into the past, to Eleanor's childhood in Oregon, to her graduate years in Geneva, to that spring in Barcelona when she'd fallen in love for the first time, with the city, not the man. I miss the way the Spanish breeze felt, she once whispered to Lillian. Her grandmother chuckled softly, then read in Spanish. Let the breeze back in through the pages. One Thursday morning. Eleanor walked into the office a few minutes later than usual. The subway had stalled briefly between stations. Still, she managed to make it before most of the building woke up. She was balancing 2 coffees, one for her, one for Trevor, when her phone rang. It was a quick call from a partner firm in Milan, looking to confirm a few phrases on a printed report. Eleanor switched effortlessly into Italian, her tone light, professional. Nathan Carlyle was walking past at that exact moment. He didn't stop, but he slowed. Just for a beat, his eyes flicked toward her, not quite curious, but not indifferent either. It wasn't a conversation he needed to be part of, but he lingered a moment longer near the coat rack than usual, adjusting his tie. Then he moved on. Eleanor noticed, but she said nothing. Later that week, a company-wide email went out, a formal invitation to a networking gala hosted by Carlyle and Gray. Black tie, cocktails, high expectations. Eleanor read it twice. She didn't attend events like that. Not because she couldn't, she had dresses for such occasions, tucked in the back of her closet, but because she didn't enjoy rooms full of forced laughter and careful conversations. When Trevor asked if she was going, she smiled politely and said, no. That evening, before heading home, she opened a document she had quietly compiled the week before, a complete, line-by-line translation of a Japanese investment brief for an upcoming meeting. No one had asked her to do it, but she had overheard a comment in the break room, something about Tokyo reps needing a local language handout, and figured it might be useful. She formatted it cleanly, checked every honorific, every nuance. Then she attached the file to an email. Subject: for your review, Tokyo Brief Japanese Translation. Body thought this might be helpful ahead of the Tuesday meeting. Signature Eleanor, no extra words, no flourish. She hit send, shut down her computer, and slipped her scarf around her neck before heading out into the cold. Back in his office, Nathan opened the email sometime after midnight. He was the last one left. He clicked on the document, expecting something clunky, or worse, unnecessary. But as he read, his brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in something else. Line after line, the translation was precise, elegant, culturally fluent in a way even their Tokyo partners often struggled to replicate. He leaned back in his chair. No notes. None. He read it again, slower this time. Then, without meaning to, he whispered to no one, It wasn't admiration. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. The next morning, Eleanor passed Nathan in the hallway. He nodded at her the same way he always did. But this time, just barely. His eyes followed her a second longer after she walked by, and for the first time, he wondered what else he might have missed. He built an empire. But somewhere along the way, he forgot what kindness sounded like. Nathan Carlyle wasn't born with a silver spoon. He earned everything with the kind of relentless drive that made people admire him and fear him in equal measure. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Pennsylvania. His father was a factory foreman who rarely spoke unless to issue correction. His mother, kind but tired, worked double shifts as a nurse. Nathan learned early that emotion got in the way. Softness was a luxury, and luxuries weren't for people like them. He put himself through college with 2 jobs and too little sleep, graduating top of his class in economics. Wall Street took notice, but Nathan didn't want to work for someone else's dream. He wanted to build his own. By 35, he had founded Carlyle & Gray. By 40, he had turned it into a multi-billion-dollar firm with clients across continents and more deals than he could count. That's how he liked things: countable, trackable, predictable. Feelings weren't once long ago. He had been in love. Her name was Claire. They met at a seminar in Boston. She was intelligent, magnetic, the kind of woman who laughed with her whole face. They were together 4 years, planned a wedding, bought a house with white shutters and a big oak tree in the front yard. 2 weeks before the ceremony, she left, not for another man, for another life. "I don't want to be swallowed by your world," she had written. "It's all steel and silence." Nathan never cried. He worked harder than ever, and every time someone said, "You're brilliant," it filled the space where kindness used to live. At Carlyle & Gray, he became legend, a man who didn't waste words or time. Employees joked that if you got a good work from him, you could retire happy. To Eleanor Hayes, he was courteous but distant. She never expected more. And Nathan never looked twice, not because she was unworthy of attention, but because he wasn't looking at anyone that way anymore. To him, she was competent, quiet, efficient, useful. But one Monday afternoon, something shifted, not dramatically, just enough to leave a dent. Trevor, a project manager with a talent for reading rooms, passed Nathan in the break room. They exchanged the usual greetings, and as Trevor poured his coffee, he said casually, "Eleanor's sharp. You know she speaks 9 languages." Nathan looked up from his phone. "Indifferent? Really?" "Yeah. I heard her on a call last week with a French rep." Switched to German without blinking. Nathan didn't respond, just returned to scrolling through market updates. But later that day, during a lull between calls, he opened her personnel file. Nothing unusual. Bachelor's degree, fluent in French and Spanish. No mention of the rest. He closed the file. Not suspicious. Just curious. The following week, a scheduling error created chaos before a global client call. Different time zones, conflicting links. An executive in Tokyo couldn't access the meeting platform, while another in Zurich was already on and growing impatient. Before Nathan could bark for assistance, the issue had resolved. He glanced up to see Eleanor at her desk, typing swiftly with one hand while her headset was on the other ear. She was guiding the Tokyo client through the interface in Japanese. Not loud, not flustered, just calm. 5 minutes later, everyone was in the call, and the meeting began like nothing had gone wrong. No one praised her. No one even noticed. But Nathan did. That evening, long after the office emptied out, he lingered at his desk. He searched her name again. This time, not in their HR system, but online. There, buried beneath years of standard job listings and brief mentions in school newsletters, he found it. Eleanor Hayes, guest lecturer, University of Geneva, Department of Applied Linguistics, years 2015-2017. He clicked through the faculty archives. There was her photo. Younger, perhaps mid-20s, but unmistakable same quiet eyes. She had taught advanced semantics and multilingual communication strategies. He sat back, None of that was on her resume. Why? Why would someone hide credentials like that unless she hadn't been trying to hide them? She just wasn't trying to be seen. Nathan closed the laptop slowly, as if the air in the room had changed. What else did he not know? What had he missed, not just about her, but about others like her, people who worked in silence, who never asked to be noticed, who just did the work beautifully. The next morning, Eleanor brought in a tray of coffees. She didn't know he liked black, no sugar. But somehow, that's what sat beside his briefing folder when he arrived. He looked at her as he took his seat. She met his gaze, briefly, just enough. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the surface. Not attraction, not admiration, not yet, just a quiet, persistent question. Who is she really that night? As snow coated the sidewalk outside, Nathan left the office later than usual. In his briefcase, along with the usual contracts and reports, was a printout of Eleanor's faculty profile from Geneva. He didn't know why he brought it home, but somehow he knew. This was just the beginning. She wasn't on the guest list, but fate doesn't care for lists. The office buzzed with energy, the kind that came with international travel and high-stakes meetings. Carlyle and Gray was sending a delegation to the European Financial Futures Conference, a gathering of elite firms, sharp minds, and even sharper egos. Amsterdam in winter was more than a city. It was a statement. Only senior partners and lead executives were invited. Names were confirmed. Flights were booked. Suitcases rolled through the office halls like subtle declarations of status. Eleanor Hayes wasn't on the list, and, truth be told, she hadn't expected to be. She read the announcement email with quiet detachment, sipped her tea, and continued reviewing a portfolio summary in German. No one asked her to. She just preferred to be prepared. The night before the team's departure, chaos rippled through the 34th floor. The professional interpreter booked weeks ago to assist with multilingual negotiations had been in a minor car accident. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep him off the plane. Nathan stood near the conference table, arms crossed, staring at the flight itinerary with cold irritation. Time was tight. Finding a replacement on such short notice, with high-level fluency in at least 4 European languages, was nearly impossible. Unless... Trevor cleared his throat. You know. Eleanor speaks, I know. Nathan interrupted. He didn't look up. There was a beat of silence, the kind that asked a question without saying a word. After a long moment, Nathan exhaled sharply. Fine. Ask if she has a valid passport. By the time Eleanor was asked to join, it was nearly 8 p.m. She didn't blink, just nodded, rose from her desk, and said she'd be ready by morning. No one saw the way her fingers trembled slightly as she zipped up her leather bag that night. She didn't pack much, a simple black coat, 2 tailored dresses, a scarf her grandmother had given her, and a worn notebook filled with pages of language notes, idioms, and cultural references she'd been collecting for years. Just in case, always just in case. The next morning, at JFK, Eleanor arrived first. She stood near the departure gate with a copy of The Little Prince in Dutch, pretending to read while watching her co-workers from the corner of her eye. No one made much of her presence. Nathan arrived 10 minutes before boarding. He didn't greet her, just handed over her boarding pass without making eye contact. Business class, a window seat. She nodded in thanks. They barely spoke during the flight. Nathan buried himself in financial briefs. Eleanor kept to herself, writing in her notebook not notes for the conference, but thoughts. Translations of passing emotions, observations, Dutch phrases she hadn't used in years. Zacht licht, soft light, She wrote it after noticing the way morning crept through the airplane window and touched the side of his face. A man hardened by time, but not entirely closed off. She didn't expect warmth from him, but she also didn't expect silence to feel this intimate. Halfway through the flight, Eleanor pulled a small folder from her bag. Inside were briefing packets, charts, and annotated notes in 4 languages. She had spent the past 3 nights preparing, just in case she'd be called upon. She wasn't told to do it, but she knew what stakes looked like, and how easily people underestimated the weight of words spoken across culture. Nathan finally glanced at her during the meal service. Not directly, just long enough to notice the handwritten charts, the careful columns labeled in Dutch, German, and French. He said nothing, but his brow furrowed, not with disapproval, something closer to reassessment. As the plane began its descent, turbulence shook them gently. Eleanor closed her notebook and looked out the window. Snow blanketed the landscape below rooftops dusted white, canals lined with bare trees. Amsterdam in January was gray and beautiful in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. She remembered her first visit, years ago when she had wandered the Jordan district, tasting Stroop waffles and hearing 5 languages in one afternoon. It was there she learned that cities have accents too, and that language, when spoken with humility, opened more doors than titles ever could. Now she was returning, not as a traveler, not as a tourist, but as a voice, a bridge, a woman who had spent years in the background, now stepping quietly, without fanfare, into a place where she might finally be heard. As the wheels touched down on the snowy runway, Eleanor tightened her scarf and looked straight ahead. This wasn't just another trip. It was, perhaps, the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. Visibility. One wrong word, and the deal would collapse. One voice spoke up and turned it all around. The conference room at the Grand Hoofd Hotel was nothing short of intimidating. Crystal chandeliers, polished oak tables, silver water pitchers and leather-bound notepads laid out with military precision. But beneath the elegance pulsed a barely contained tension. 2 investment firms, one American, one Dutch, had spent 6 months dancing around the terms of a major joint venture. This meeting was supposed to be the final step. All parties were present, interpreters in place, presentations queued, and within the first 20 minutes, it started to unravel. It began with a single phrase. The lead interpreter, flown in that morning to replace the injured one, stumbled over a key Dutch term in a financial clause. He translated tijdelijke opshorting as termination rather than temporary suspension. The difference was subtle, but in high finance, subtlety is everything. Ingrid van Dijk, the Dutch partner, stiffened. Her team murmured to one another in quick, clipped sentences. Nathan Carlyle, seated at the head of the American delegation, narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, sensing the change but not yet understanding it. The Dutch side spoke in hushed tones. One man shook his head, visibly agitated. Eleanor sat near the end of the table, her notebook open, pen resting quietly on the page. She heard it, the error. She knew what had just happened, and what would happen next if no one corrected it. There was a moment, fragile and fleeting, where she could have stayed silent. She wasn't on the agenda. She wasn't even supposed to speak. But then she stood, calmly, without fanfare. All eyes turned to her, some confused, others impatient. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice steady. "If I may, I believe there's been a misinterpretation." She turned toward the Dutch delegation and, in fluid, confident Dutch, addressed Ingrid directly. "Wat bedoeld werd, is tijdelijke opschorting van de voorwaarden, niet een definitieve beëindiging." What was intended is temporary suspension of terms. not a permanent termination. A pause. Then Ingrid blinked. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She exchanged a glance with her colleagues. One of them nodded. Eleanor continued, switching effortlessly into German to clarify a separate clause for a partner from Munich, then into Italian to respond to a side question about regulatory timelines, and again into Spanish this time with warmth when one of the Madrid-based consultants brought up market volatility. She didn't just translate words. She translated tone, emotion, context. She paused when she sensed resistance, smiled when warmth was needed, softened phrases that sounded too aggressive, sharpened ones that risked ambiguity. Within 20 minutes, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. No longer defensive, no longer guarded, just connected. Nathan watched from the head of the table, hands folded in front of him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even blink. He had never seen her like this. So composed, so precise, and yet not robotic. There was empathy in every inflection, command in every pause. She wasn't helping the conversation, she was steering it. Ingrid leaned forward, suddenly more animated. Her voice trembled, not with anger, but emotion. She spoke to Eleanor, not to the room. "My father was a translator," she said in Dutch. "He always said it was more about listening than speaking." Eleanor responded gently. "Then I must be doing him proud." And just like that, the ice cracked. The meeting concluded with handshakes, real ones. Contracts were outlined, signatures penciled in. The impossible deal had not only survived, it had deepened. And as people began to gather their things, someone from the Belgian contingent leaned toward Nathan and asked, half in jest, half in awe, "She's your secretary." There was a long pause. Nathan looked up, straightened in his chair, and glanced at Eleanor, now quietly organizing her notes at the end of the table. His voice was quieter than usual, but unmistakably certain. "No," he said slowly. "She's something else. Outside." The sky had turned a soft winter gray. Snowflakes began to drift lazily down the window panes. The group filtered into the hallway, heading toward the evening gala, the formal dinner where firm representatives and partners would toast the day's success over candlelit tables and polished crystal. Usually, Eleanor would have returned to her room, but this time, she had an invitation, hand-delivered. Nathan didn't say anything when he handed it to her, just gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before walking away. Eleanor stood for a moment in the empty conference room, fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. For the first time, she wasn't invited because she was useful. She was invited because she belonged. As the ballroom doors opened and the warm hum of conversation spilled into the marble corridor, Eleanor took a slow breath and stepped forward toward a table she was finally meant to sit at. And somewhere behind her, Nathan watched, without saying a word, but this time, he smiled. She didn't just speak 9 languages. She made people feel heard. The ballroom shimmered with the soft glow of chandelier light. Elegant music drifted through the air like fine mist, barely louder than the hum of polite conversation. Crystal glasses clinked, cutlery tapped against porcelain, and laughter rose and fell in smooth, cultivated tones. And yet, amid the perfectly polished evening, all eyes, one by one, began drifting toward a quiet presence at table 6. Eleanor Hayes. She wore a simple navy blue dress, nothing flashy. Her hair swept into a low bun, no jewelry, save for a silver ring that once belonged to her mother. But there was something about her. It began with a woman from Madrid, who approached between courses, speaking in hesitant English to compliment Eleanor's calm presence during the meeting. Eleanor responded in Spanish. Not textbook Spanish, not stiff or overly formal. It rolled gently, like she had learned it on sun-warmed streets, under the rhythm of cafe conversations and late-night storytelling. The woman's eyes lit up. "Oh, you speak like my cousin from Cordoba." Eleanor smiled. "Then I must be doing something right." That exchange sparked a ripple. Moments later, a Dutch gentleman came over curious if she'd ever visited his hometown. She responded in Dutch, describing a small bookstore near the canal and the way the trees looked in late autumn. Then came a French banker with a thick Marseille accent, delighted to find someone who could understand his jokes without translation. A German delegate, an Italian professor, even a hesitant Swiss associate who hadn't spoken much all evening until Eleanor greeted him in German-Swiss dialect, so softly and naturally that he nearly dropped his wine glass in surprise. From the far end of the ballroom, Nathan Carlyle watched it unfold. He wasn't at her table, but he didn't need to be. What struck him wasn't her fluency, impressive as it was her presence. She wasn't dazzling them, she wasn't performing, she was connecting. She didn't list her accomplishments, though they would have been impressive. She didn't talk about degrees or awards or firms she had once worked with. Instead, she asked about people's hometowns, their favorite childhood meals, the stories their grandparents used to tell. She listened when others would have spoken, and when she did speak, it was never to impress. It was to make someone feel like they mattered. A Japanese businessman, elderly, dignified, approached her near dessert. He bowed slowly, out of both custom and caution. These conferences were rarely warm places, but something about Eleanor had softened the room. Eleanor rose and bowed in return, her voice lowering instinctively into polished, respectful Japanese. They exchanged words quietly, only a few, before he turned to those nearby and said in English, "Gently, she reminds me of my daughter, the one who always asked if I'd eaten before asking for anything else." The words, spoken simply, lingered longer than the music. A few around him nodded, unexpectedly moved, and, for Nathan standing with one hand in his pocket, untouched drink in the other, the tightness he'd been ignoring all night moved a little closer to the surface. He didn't understand it. Not fully. But it was there. Later. Eleanor was asked how she managed to speak so many languages. She smiled, tilting her head as if to rewind time. "My grandmother," she said softly. "She used to sing me lullabies in French, read me stories in Spanish. We didn't have much, but we had words." Someone asked where she studied. She paused, then answered, "Mostly in kitchens, on trains, in marketplaces. I learned that people open up when you try to speak their heart language, not just the grammar, but the feeling." She spoke about food, about how different cultures had their own ways of saying, "I love you," without ever using those words. Sometimes it's in a dish they insist you take home, or a scarf they wrap around your shoulders. Language isn't just what we say, it's how we say "I see you." The table fell quiet, and for a moment, brief and real, the masks dropped. Nathan felt something shift again. The woman who had been invisible in his office for months was now the gravity of an entire room. She hadn't changed. He had. He was seeing her for the first time, not just as a brilliant mind, not even as an exceptional communicator, but as someone who made people feel safe in a world that rewarded noise and speed. He stayed longer than he meant to, longer than he usually did. But somewhere during the third course, as Eleanor laughed openly, unguardedly with a consultant from Milan, Nathan felt a stillness come over him. It wasn't longing, not yet. It was slowing. Something in him was slowing down a beat, a breath, a question he couldn't name. He wasn't used to being stirred by softness, but tonight it stirred something in him just the same. He slipped out before dessert ended. Not loudly. No one noticed. No one except Eleanor, who caught a glimpse of him near the exit. Eyes unreadable. Coat folded over his arm. His gaze resting on her just a moment longer than it should have. As the doors closed softly behind him, Eleanor turned back to her table. She didn't know what the look meant, but something about it stayed with her even as the music swelled again and another guest leaned in, asking in Portuguese about her favorite poem. She smiled and answered not just with words, but with heart. Some silences are loud enough to change everything. The applause was long over. The ballroom had emptied out in waves, laughter fading into footsteps, music replaced by the hush of rolling suitcases and whispered goodbyes. Eleanor stood quietly by the window of the hotel lobby, watching snow flurries swirl beneath a street lamp. Her reflection looked different in the glass tonight, not transformed, but more visible, like someone coming into focus after being out of frame for too long. Nathan arrived moments later, his coat draped neatly over one arm, scarf still folded, like he hadn't quite decided whether to wear it or not. He gave a brief nod when he saw her, and she returned it without words. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was full. Their flight boarded just before sunrise. First class was nearly empty, save for a few diplomats and executives who had long since mastered the art of sleeping through takeoff. Nathan took the aisle, Eleanor the window. A quiet truce sat between them. At 30,000 feet, the hum of the engine filled the space where conversation might have lived. Then, something shifted. Nathan stood and returned minutes later from the galley, balancing 2 paper cups. He set one gently on Eleanor's tray table. "Chamomile," he said. "Figured you could use something gentle." Eleanor blinked. Of all the things she expected from him, a cup of tea wasn't one. "Thank you," she said softly, curling her hands around the warmth. He sat back in his seat, didn't explain, didn't ask, but after a few sips, he spoke. "I should have seen you sooner." She glanced sideways. Nathan kept his eyes forward. "I've spent most of my life scanning for numbers, deliverables, outcomes. It's efficient, but it makes people invisible." Eleanor didn't interrupt. She just listened. "I assumed you were only what your resume said," he continued, "and even then, I didn't read it carefully." She smiled, just slightly. "You only saw what I let you see." That made him turn toward her, brows lifting. "Why would you hide any of it?" Eleanor looked down at her cup. The tea was still steaming, the scent soft and floral, because being underestimated, she said, is sometimes quieter than being misjudged. People leave you alone. You can observe, learn, prepare, without having to defend who you are all the time. Nathan absorbed that, eyes fixed on the clouds just beyond the window. "I get that," he said after a long pause. "Maybe more than I want to admit." They didn't speak for a while after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because some truths don't need repeating. Eleanor eventually opened her notebook, flipping through pages of notes, phrases, reflections. The pages were filled not just with translations, but memories, fragments of people and places that had shaped her. She stopped on a pressed flower, small and brittle, hidden between pages dated 2 years ago in Geneva. "My grandmother used to press flowers between books," she said, almost to herself. "Said they kept stories alive longer that way." Nathan tilted his head. "Is she the one who taught you French?" Eleanor nodded. "And how to say, 'I miss you' in 7 other languages." There was a tenderness in her tone that Nathan hadn't heard before. "She raised me after my parents died," Eleanor added quietly. brought me up on library books, black tea, and stories from a world she never got to visit. Nathan set down his cup, his hands folded together. My mother died of cancer. He said, I was 24, thought I had more time. Eleanor looked at him, not with pity but with presence. I missed her last call. He continued. She left a message, said she was proud of me. I deleted it. Why? Eleanor asked gently. I don't know, he said. Maybe because hearing it made it real. The hum of the plane felt louder in the silence that followed. Eleanor didn't say I'm sorry, and she didn't offer a quote or a platitude. She just let the moment breathe. And somehow, that was enough. Later. As the cabin lights dimmed, Eleanor leaned her head against the window. Outside, the sky was a wash of ink blue and soft gray, a quiet in-between before sunrise. Nathan glanced over. She looked peaceful. Not tired, exactly, just at rest. Her scarf had slipped slightly from her shoulder, and her breath fogged a tiny circle on the glass. For a moment, Nathan just watched. Not with analysis, not with calculation, but with something slower, softer. She wasn't his secretary. She wasn't just the woman who salvaged a deal or spoke 9 languages. She was someone who had lived, someone who had lost, someone who carried stillness like it was something sacred. She shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering once, then closing again. Nathan reached for the folded airline blanket. Carefully, almost awkwardly, he draped it over her shoulders, tucked a corner beneath her chin. She didn't stir, but a faint smile played at the corner of her mouth. Nathan sat back, unsure if she was asleep or just letting the silence say what they didn't need to. He looked out the window across the aisle. Somewhere below them, the ocean stretched endless and black. Somewhere ahead, New York waited with its deadlines and decisions and noise. But here, in this thin slice of air and altitude, there was only this: a cup of tea, a folded blanket, a quiet between 2 people who, for the first time in a long time, didn't need to speak to be heard. As the first pink light crept over the edge of the horizon, Nathan closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember what stillness felt like and who had brought it back. She returned as a secretary, but nothing about her felt the same anymore. The revolving doors spun slowly that Monday morning as Eleanor stepped into the familiar buzz of Carlisle and Gray. Phones were ringing. Elevators dinged at regular intervals. Colleagues hurried past, clutching coffee and printouts, immersed in the rhythm of another financial week. But something was different. People noticed her now, not just in the way you acknowledge a face in the hallway, but the way you pause before speaking, unsure if you're addressing someone ordinary or someone significant. Whispers trailed her. That's her. Right. The one from Amsterdam. She speaks like 10 languages. I heard she saved the deal in 5 minutes flat. Most of it wasn't accurate, but Eleanor didn't correct them. She simply walked toward her desk with the same calm steps, placed her bag in its usual corner, and turned on her computer, like always. But inside, there was something quieter, deeper. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a steady, grounded sense of enough. She moved through the day as she always had, replying to emails, coordinating meetings, handling schedules, yet even the hum of the copier seemed to shift around her, like the office itself had realigned its attention. Even Trevor, always the first to crack a joke by the water cooler, glanced up when she passed, offering a smile that was more thoughtful this time. Just before lunch, her email chimed. Subject line: private. Sender Nathan Carlisle. No greeting, no flourish. Just a few words. Clipped and clear, effective immediately. I'm recommending your transition to Strategic Communications Advisor. Full title: and compensation update pending. Thank you for seeing what no one else did and having the courage to act on it. No sign-off, just an Eleanor read it once. Then again. She didn't smile. She didn't forward it. She didn't even reply. She simply let the words settle inside her, like a stone sinking gently to the bottom of a still lake. That evening, she didn't stay late. Instead, she rode the subway back to Brooklyn and stepped quietly into her grandmother's apartment, where the air smelled faintly of lavender and slow-simmered broth. Lillian sat near the window, wrapped in a knit shawl, her gaze drifting somewhere between memory and the present. "Is it still Monday?" the older woman asked, blinking slowly. Eleanor kneeled beside her, placing a warm hand over the older one. "It is, but I brought lemon scones." Lillian smiled. A little. "Did you speak any beautiful words today?" Eleanor leaned in and whispered, "Querencia." "Ah," Lillian breathed, "the place where the soul rests." Back at the office, things were shifting, even if subtly. Nathan didn't make any announcements, but people noticed he had started walking Eleanor's way more often. Sometimes with a question about a phrase in French, other times with a document that just needed a glance. But increasingly, with no paper at all. Just presence. One afternoon, while reviewing investor notes, he paused beside her desk and asked, "What's your favorite Italian word?" Eleanor looked up, thought for a moment. "Intuizione," she said softly. "It means intuition, knowing, without knowing how." Nathan didn't say anything at first, but his eyes lingered. Trevor noticed it too. He'd always admired Eleanor, her quiet strength, her brilliance cloaked in humility. There had been a time when he hoped maybe, just maybe, she'd see him the same way he saw her. But now, he recognized the glance Nathan gave her from across the room. Not just interest, not even admiration. It was something more difficult to name. It was changed. So Trevor began to step back, not in resentment, but in grace. He stopped finding reasons to linger by her desk. He passed documents through interns, and when she caught his eye in a meeting, he only smiled, the kind that said, "I see you. I always did. But now someone else finally does too." One Thursday morning, Eleanor arrived earlier than usual. The building was still yawning into the day, coffee machines sputtering, elevator doors just starting their rhythm. Her desk was neat, exactly as she had left it. Except for one thing. A small, folded piece of paper sat in the center, not printed, handwritten, heavy, confident strokes. She opened it. Family first. Take the day off. And no context, no explanation. Just permission. Just care written the only way Nathan Carlyle knew how to express it. Eleanor stared at the note for a moment. Then she folded it again carefully, reverently, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, where it would stay, warm against her heart. She didn't leave right away. She organized her desk, cleared her inbox, left 2 sticky notes for interns. Then, without a word to anyone, she stepped out into the cold morning air, toward the train that would take her back to a small kitchen in Brooklyn, where a woman named Lillian would ask about the meaning of new words over ginger tea, and where silence would feel, once again, like home. Back at Carlyle and Gray, her chair sat empty. But the space she left behind felt fuller than ever, not because of her absence, but because of everything she had quietly become. He thought he knew numbers. She taught him how to listen. The boardroom was unusually quiet for a Thursday afternoon. No sharp suits, no slide decks, no heated debate about quarterly projections, just a whiteboard, a half-circle of chairs, and Eleanor Hayes standing at the front of the room with a soft smile and a stack of worn flashcards. "Welcome," she said. Bienvenidos. There was an awkward shuffle of papers and throat clearings from the executives who had agreed reluctantly or curiously to attend the new language and culture enrichment series Eleanor had proposed. But no one moved to leave. Not when she explained how language helped bridge not just countries, but misunderstandings. Not when she told a short story in Spanish about a man who ordered caballo instead of cabbage at a market in Madrid and ended up with a horse tied to his door. Not when she laughed gently and said, "Every mistake is just an unopened window." Even Nathan Carlyle, seated quietly at the edge of the group, didn't check his watch once. He just listened. Eleanor walked among them, correcting pronunciation softly, encouraging effort without judgment. "Try again," she said kindly to a VP who stumbled over mañana. "Let your tongue rest behind your teeth." She coached another. "It's not about speed. It's about feeling the shape of the word." When it was Nathan's turn, she stood beside him closer than usual and spoke the word first. "Gracias." Nathan repeated it. Too sharp. Again. Too flat. Eleanor didn't flinch. She placed a hand briefly on the edge of his desk and said, "Relax your jaw. Let it come from the back, not the front." He tried again. Slower. Softer. This time, it was close enough to reel. "Better," she said, then added just for him, just low enough. "You're better at this than you think." After the session, while the others returned to their worlds of contracts and clock-ins, Nathan lingered. Eleanor packed up her flashcards, her tone still light. She didn't look at him, didn't ask why he stayed. But before she left the room, she pulled a small paperback from her bag, a Spanish-English pocket dictionary, well thumbed and marked with tiny tabs, and placed it quietly on the corner of his desk. Inside, on the first page, she had written in her neat, slanted hand, "You're better at this than you think. That night. Nathan sat in his office long after the others had gone. He turned pages of the little dictionary like they were chapters of a book he hadn't known he'd wanted to read. He thought about the way Eleanor had spoken, clear, gentle, never condescending, how she had taught without performing, led without ego, and how, for the first time in years, he felt like a student again, not in the boardroom, but in life. At nearly midnight, he typed a short message. If I had to learn one more language, could it be the language of second chances? He stared at the screen for a long moment before hitting send. No emojis, no signature, just words. Words that asked without expectation. Words that said more than they seemed to. She didn't reply that night, or the next morning. And when he walked into the office at 7:30, his mind had already begun cataloging all the reasons she might stay silent. Professionalism, boundaries, indifference, grace. But as he entered his office, he stopped short. His desk, usually empty and precise, had a new addition. A steaming cup of black coffee just the way he liked it. No cream, no sugar. Next to it, a folded note on cream-colored paper. He opened it. Only 5 words were written. In clean ink, Lesson 1 begins at noon. No name, no explanation, just an open door. Nathan sat down slowly, the coffee warming his hands. Outside, the city stirred as usual horns, sirens, hurried footsteps. But inside, something had quieted. He didn't know what the next lesson would be, but he knew he'd be on time. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in his life, Nathan Carlyle was ready to learn something he couldn't measure. Something written not on charts or contracts, but in the quiet between two people who finally saw each other clearly. She never asked for recognition, but the world had no choice but to see her. The elevator chimed as it reached the top floor, a sound Eleanor had heard for years, though it felt somehow different now. She stepped out, passing the glass panels etched with the company's name. But this time, her destination wasn't the secretary's desk. It wasn't the conference room. It wasn't the back row of a board meeting. It was the corner office. Hers. A new plaque had just been installed outside the door. Eleanor Hayes, Director of Multicultural Communications. No fanfare, no balloons or speeches, just quiet acknowledgement. And that, for her, was enough. The announcement had caught many by surprise, but not those who'd seen her in Amsterdam. Not those who had felt her presence during the language workshops. Not those who had noticed the quiet shifts in Nathan Carlisle's daily rhythm, the way he stopped by her desk, the way his tone softened around her name. Even Trevor had come by with a warm smile and a heartfelt handshake. "You made the invisible unforgettable," he said simply. Eleanor had held his hand just a little longer than expected. Some connections don't become romance. They become respect. In her first act as director, Eleanor organized a company-wide event, Words That Carry Us, a day where every department shared gratitude in a language not their own. Receptionists greeted in Mandarin. Analysts exchanged thanks in Tagalog. Executives practiced Swahili phrases. Someone even brought tamales with a handwritten recipe from their grandmother. But the most surprising moment came from Nathan himself. When it was his turn, he stood before the room, cleared his throat, and in slow, deliberate Dutch, said dank je, Eleanor, voor je geduld en voor je stilte. Thank you, Eleanor, for your patience and for your silence. He sat down, said nothing more, but he didn't need to. The room was still. A few weeks later, winter returned to New York in the form of a gentle snow, drifting over rooftops like dust from forgotten pages. It was on such a morning that Eleanor got the call. Her grandmother, Lillian, had passed in her sleep. No pain, no fear, just a slow exhale, as if the old woman had finished her last sentence. Eleanor didn't cry. She folded the blanket still warm from Lillian's lap. She made the tea they would have shared. She placed the pressed flower they had saved last spring inside her notebook, and then she went to work. Nathan noticed. He didn't say anything. But that afternoon, after the meetings were done and the lights dimmed, he stepped into her office without knocking. Eleanor was at her desk, staring at nothing, a pen unmoving in her hand. He didn't ask what happened. He just sat down across from her. In silence, minutes passed. No words, just the ticking of the clock. Finally, Eleanor whispered. She used to say that love is the language we forget the fastest. Nathan looked at her gently, and yet you remember hers. That night, the office was empty except for her. She stayed, not to catch up on work, but because grief sometimes needs structure. A chair, a lamp, a space to hold its weight. As she gathered her coat, her inbox pinged. One new message. Subject Amsterdam. Remembered. It was from Ingrid. You were unforgettable. It read, attached an audio clip Eleanor's voice, from that conference room in Amsterdam. Calm, precise, poised, speaking Dutch like it was her first breath. That moment when the deal had nearly collapsed and her voice had stitched it back together. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening. She hadn't remembered someone recording it, but hearing it now felt like hearing herself for the first time. The next morning, Eleanor arrived early. The city was just waking. The lights of Manhattan still flickered like stars, trying not to fade. She stood at the window of her new office, a mug of tea warming her fingers. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. The door opened, no knock. Nathan entered, coffee in hand. He paused for a moment before speaking. Ready for lesson 2. Eleanor turned, eyebrows raised in quiet amusement. Lesson 2. He shrugged. I figured if you taught me how to say thank you, maybe you could teach me how to say stay. Eleanor's gaze softened. Blythe, she said. Simply, that's Dutch. Nathan smiled, and in Eleanor, she paused, then stepped closer. Close enough to smell his cologne, light and woodsy, just like she remembered from Amsterdam. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't need to. Her answer was in her eyes, in the stillness she carried like a second skin. Always, she said, and that was enough. Outside, the city roared on cabs honking, sirens crying, towers scraping sky. But in that room, it was quiet. Not the kind of silence that weighs heavy, the kind that heals. 2 people, 2 chairs, one unspoken language finally understood, and between them, no more translation needed. In a world that often rewards the loudest voices and the boldest gestures, it's easy to forget the quiet strength of those who work behind the scenes. Eleanor's story reminds us that true value isn't always recognized at first glance, but it never disappears. Patience, integrity, and kindness may not bring instant praise, but they build something deeper: trust, respect, and quiet influence. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to know who you are and keep showing up with grace. Sometimes the most powerful language is not the one spoken aloud, but the one written in how we treat others in silence, in stillness, in steady presence. So if you've ever felt unseen or overlooked, remember your time will come. Your voice matters, and the world may surprise you, just when you think it never noticed. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel. Every click, every comment helps us continue telling stories that speak to the quiet, beautiful strength inside us all. See you in the next one.